Ooh, shake a shake. Hi guys, this is Connie, back with more Connie Reads. I'm currently in a couple of books, but this time we're going to do Blindsided by God. So here we go. Chapter 1. It's Aspen, not Old Spice. I fell in love with Carol the first moment I saw her, but I never imagined how much pain this would eventually cause me. Well, my wife, an unromantic sort of woman, would deny that love at first sight is possible, but I stand by my memories of that day. It was the first Sunday of my first week at Yale, and I was visiting a small church called New Haven Korean Church, which was paradoxically located in the nearby town of Hamden and not in New Haven itself. As I walked through the front doors of this inaptly named church, there she was, handing out bulletins, a petite woman whose eyes radiated warmth and kindness, eyes I could not help but look into for much longer than what was considered polite. My future wife. Roll your eyes or groan if you like. It doesn't matter to me, as I can neither see nor hear you. Nor would I care if I could, because it was hardly the only moment that demonstrates that I loved my wife from very early on. For example, not more than 1 month after meeting Carol, I was sitting in a dorm room with some guys from the Christian fellowship that Carol and I both attended. At some point during the night, someone posed the question, "Who do you think is the ideal woman?" Which was just the Christianized version of, "Who do you think is really hot?" Everyone else needed a moment to collect their thoughts and most likely to separate their honest gut response from their more sanitized Christian one. I need nothing of the sort. Carol Bang, I immediately blurted out. They all looked at me in shock. I didn't even bother to volunteer their own answers. My answer had beaten all of their own, both in speed and in depth of conviction. The first step in my grand scheme to woo my future wife was to invite her to a dance, where my dancing skills would surely sweep her off her feet, figuratively or literally. Either was fine. The afternoon of the dance, I raced home from class and with giddy excitement changed into the only suit I owned. But as I looked at myself in the mirror, I realized that the jacket and pants were mismatched shades of black. At such a tender age, I didn't even know that was possible. How could black have shades? Wasn't it all just black? I was horrified. Carol was surely too mature to go out with an adolescent who didn't even own a matching suit. Who didn't yet own a matching suit. Or maybe I had her all wrong, that she was mature enough to see through such trivialities and recognize who I was beneath the cheap suit. Whatever the case, I wasn't going to take chances that she was more of the latter and less of the former. So to cover for my deficiency, I used cologne. Lots of it. As I left the dorm, I heard a snarky girl exclaim, "Did someone drop a bottle of Old Spice out there?" I scoffed. It was Aspen, not Old Spice, you ignoramus. Anxious with expectation, I arrived at the dance far too early and spent the next hour picking fretfully at my cheap mismatched suit and checking my watch at the half-minute intervals. It was nearly an hour before Carol arrived. She was simply dressed, a plain black dress with black shoes, no makeup, and her hair was not made up in any way whatsoever. In fact, it looked as if she had simply put on a dress and walked out the door, a fact she confirmed to me many years later. A more perceptive person might have been crestfallen, interpreting this to mean that Carol didn't see this dance as a big deal in the least. But at that moment, a less perceptive person I could not have been. Smitten by love, I thought she looked positively beautiful. Here's a picture. It says, "Our first date, 1998. It's hard to see in this photo, but my jacket and pants are mismatched shades of black." So, pictures. Aww. We danced and twirled for hours, coughing only mildly as we parted the thin mist of aspen cologne that trailed me everywhere I went. Once the dance was over, I offered to walk Carol home to her dorm, which was on the opposite side of the campus. It was a bitterly cold Connecticut night, and as we passed the library, a particularly stiff wind tore across the grounds. I leapt in front of her to block her from the blast, hoping she would find this a gallant gesture, although, in retrospect, it was a little silly. It was clear that Carol saw it in that second, more foolish light, because I marched directly in front of her, shoulders dramatically braced against the cold. She began to convulse in laughter. You might imagine this would be a painful memory for me, the prospective love of your life guffawing at your juvenile attempt at chivalry. And it would have been, except that she then grabbed my hand and pulled me to her side, clutching my arm tightly with both of her own. I tried not to let it show too much, but this, my friends, was the best moment of my life up to that point. A few weeks later, I asked Carol to be my girlfriend. A questionable decision, given she was a senior who was going to graduate in 2 months and move back to Los Angeles, and I was a freshman who had 3 years of college remaining. But the age gap, brief time frame, and long distance didn't deter me in the slightest. She was the love of my life, and we were going to make it. And I remained absolutely certain of this fact for nearly 4 years, right up until I graduated from college and Carol unceremoniously dumped me for another guy. I spent the next year in a state of deep and unrelenting depression. I struggled to accept the fact that Carol was no longer part of my life and desperately tried to purge her from my memory. I destroyed every picture I had of her. I threw away every letter she had written. I gave away every present she had bought. Unfortunately, this meant that I lost the better half of my wardrobe in a single weekend. My feeble attempts to date other women, which went as well as you probably expect. A woman from my church set me up on a date with her daughter, and being the desperate soul I was at the time, I decided to give it a shot. I didn't have high hopes going to this encounter, but when we met in a coffee shop in New Haven, I was pleasantly surprised. My date was pretty, intelligent, and possessed a sense of humor tinged with brutal sarcasm, a trait I always found desirable, despite the fact that biting wit was hardly a characteristic you want in someone you will inevitably disagree with. I was surprised to find myself attracted to her, an encouraging sign in itself, given that I had a difficult time feeling any emotion except dejection. I thought this initial attraction might blossom into something more, but it did the opposite. Our conversation, which was lively at first, became more and more halting and awkward before finally setting into an impenetrable miasma of uncomfortable silence. By the end, my attention stood fixed on the incredibly interesting half-empty coffee cup in my hands, while my date stared forlornly out the window, wondering what the other 100 ways she could have better spent the last hour of her life. Embarrassed, I apologized to her for being such a terrible date and blamed my lack of conversation on tiredness. She was kind enough to give me a sympathetic and sincere smile, but paired it with a wry observation. You know, I think you may want to consider that you're not quite over your ex just yet. She gave my hand a pat, stood up from the table, and walked away with the slightest flick of her hair, as if to communicate what she thought of me. And she was right, of course. While hanging out with an attractive, intelligent woman, the only person I could think about was the person who was no longer thinking about me. I never imagined that love and pain might be related. I always thought the two were separate, or even opposite. Love is good, suffering is bad. If someone loves you, they would never make you suffer. And if they did make you suffer, it proved that they didn't love you. If the two shared any relationship, it was one of mutual exclusivity, as if suffering was somehow the mathematical inverse of love, and that the two could not coexist in the same person or the same universe. This might seem a juvenile outlook, but it is what I had been led to believe by countless songs, movies, and TV shows, that love is a panacea, the answer to all of life's problems and ills. As John Lennon once famously wrote, "All you need is love. Love is all you need." If John Lennon is too old for you, perhaps you've heard the song by Jason Mraz that states nearly the same thing. All you need is love, love, love. Or take the example of romantic comedies, whose plots usually include a funny but unattractive sidekick friend, as well as a breakup, a betrayal, even a minor tragedy. All of these heartbreaking situations find their conclusion in the final moments where the guy gets the girl, or the girl gets the guy, and they embrace in some inspiring locale, after which the screen fades to black and the credits roll. What else are you supposed to glean from this, except that love is the answer that ties up all the messy hurts of our lives into a neat and tidy package? It was with this same delusional mentality that I had approached my relationship with Carol. Never did I imagine that the person I loved most also held the potential to hurt me the worst. Instead, I naively clung to the misguided illusion that love made me invincible, when by its very nature it did the opposite. so I developed my relationship with her to the exclusion of nearly all others, graduating from college with a photo album filled with a picture after picture of Carol and me, but precious few of anyone else and me. Even worse, I made no effort to plan my life after graduation, except move to whatever city Carol lived in. True love required nothing more. So when Carol and I broke up, I was caught completely unaware and unprepared, like a man who steps out of a plane expecting to bask in the warmth of the Bahamas, but is greeted instead by a blast of bitter Arctic cold. In what seemed like an instant, I had not just lost my girlfriend, but my best friend. In many ways, my only friend, as well as the past 4 years of my life and my plans for the future. It was love that had positioned me so perfectly for heartbreak. This tendency is hardly just my own, nor is it limited to romantic relationships. Whether it is with our careers, our families, our dreams, or with anyone or anything that we love, we often position ourselves for deeper and sharper pain when we pursue these things without considering how fragile the floor is beneath our feet, or what would happen should that floor give way. We imagine that love will never hurt us, which is not like playing catch with an olive green metal ball that has a curious circular pin attached to it. Oh! And when suffering does inevitably crash through the floor, we find ourselves traumatized, scandalized, demanding to know what it is doing here and who is to blame, not realizing that it is ultimately we who left that door unlocked. Seeing love and suffering as mutually exclusive also allows us to entertain an especially dangerous conception of God. When we find ourselves in the midst of a particularly difficult season of life, it is only natural to ask ourselves that most thorny of philosophical questions. How can a God who loves us allow us to suffer? After all, we reason, a loving and all-powerful God would never allow us to endure pain or hardship, but since we do suffer in life, and sometimes quite terribly, it seems that the only conclusions available to us are that God doesn't love us, or that he is not powerful, or that he doesn't exist. There are no other answers. Suffering precludes the existence of a good and loving God, and so our faith is foolish and intellectually untenable. At the root of this train of thought lies a familiar assumption that God cannot simultaneously love us and also permit us to suffer, or again, that suffering and love are somehow mutually exclusive. On the surface, it seems like a safe enough assumption. After all, how could anyone who loves another allow them to suffer? But the truth is, there are many instances in which this is the case. Parents do this all the time. They allow their kids to get painful shots at the doctor. They permit a dentist to drill a hole in their children's teeth to place a filling. Parents will do the pain-inflicting themselves, taking away their kids' privileges, grounding them, or even spanking them. Do parents do this because they hate their children or take pleasure in their pain? Of course not. Although what parents consider best often differs wildly from that of their progeny. God himself is no different. That is why it says in the book of Hebrews, endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children. For what children are not disciplined by their father? If you are not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not legitimate, not true sons and daughters at all. Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live? They discipline us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good, in order that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Hebrews 12, verses 7 through 11. When we suffer, it does not necessarily mean that God does not love us or that he doesn't exist. God allows us to suffer because in his wisdom he knows that the suffering is somehow necessary and even beneficial, and in his sovereignty he is able to transform even the worst of circumstances for the good of those who love him. So if God is anything like a loving parent, which I believe he is, He certainly might allow us to suffer, all while still loving us quite deeply. While seeming benign, even endearing, the naive notion that suffering and love are mutually exclusive is an insidious one. It leaves us brutally unprepared for pain, and on a theological level, it falsely leads us to think that because we hurt, God must not love us. No, love and suffering will always be tied to one another. Rejection by anyone is painful enough, but never worse than when it comes at the hands of someone you care about. That is why our family makes us want to tear the hair from our heads, not because they mean nothing to us, but because they mean everything. Similarly, the grief and pain you experience when you lose someone is directly connected to that place they held in your heart. The closer to the center they resided, the greater the hole they will leave behind. So unless we want to be forever scandalized by the reality of suffering, it is vital that we jettison this assumption and accept the reality that pain and love always come hand in hand. Always. But fortunately, this is not the end of the relationship between love and suffering, nor was it the end of my relationship with Carol. Ooh, there's a picture. There's a picture that we're going to hear more about soon. Awesome. Carol worked 6 months in Afghanistan helping to set up health services, 2002. My breakup with Carol took place in the fall of 2001, at nearly the same time as 9/11 and the subsequent invasion of Afghanistan by the United States. These tragic events lent an even more catastrophic air to what I was going through personally. It seemed that there wasn't a shred of good news to be found anywhere in the world, which only compounded the deep sense of personal depression and sadness I was already experiencing. But this was also significant because Carol had graduated from Yale with a master's degree in international public health, and worked for an organization that set up emergency health facilities in war zones throughout the world. Liberia, Eritrea. I'm so sorry that I'm going to end up butchering that country's name. Eritrea, Burundi, and Afghanistan. And so, only months after the Twin Towers plummeted to the streets of Manhattan, she was sent into Afghanistan to make sure that medical services were available to those people who were most affected. Not only had my girlfriend dumped me, but she would be traveling to the most dangerous part of the world, where I would have little to no ability to contact her, and therefore no way of knowing if she was safe, nor any hope of salvaging our wrecked relationship. If I had any illusions about it before, they were gone now. It was over. We were over. Or so I thought until the summer of 2002, nearly a year after our breakup. One very early morning, I got a call on my cell phone. Groggingly, I picked it up and looked at the screen. I was bewildered to find it crammed with numbers. Why are there so many numbers there? And what is area code 93? Filled with skepticism and no small measure of ill will, I answered the phone with a curt, "Hello?" In response, a faintly British voice said to me, "Hello, is this Peter?" I had never spoken to a faintly British person in my entire life, much less at 5 a.m, so I didn't immediately answer yes. I said very unintelligently, instead, I very unintelligently responded with, "What? This is Peter Chin." Yes, this is Peter. I mean, Peter, who is this? Peter, my name is Clementina, and I'm friends with Carol. We're here in Afghanistan together. As if someone had thrown a bucket of ice water over me, I threw off my covers and jumped out of bed. But it wasn't out of excitement, it was fear. I immediately assumed the worst, that Carol had been injured or even killed in an attack, or perhaps kidnapped, and her friend was calling me to break the news. This may seem like an overreaction on my part, but it was not. In fact, only a few years after this, Clementina herself would be kidnapped at gunpoint, only to be released after a sustained outcry from the many Afghan women that she had helped. She continued, "Anyway, I just wanted to say hi to you before I handed the phone off to Carol, and I must say your voice sounds very sexy. Goodbye, Peter." I harbored any resentment toward Clementina for calling me that early in the morning. It immediately evaporated when she said I had a sexy voice. It's hard to stay mad at someone who is marvelously perceptive. But even more wonderful, I was going to talk to Carol for the first time in nearly a year. I had imagined this situation countless times before I had prepared exactly what I could say to her if given the chance. First, I would play it cool and say hello very casually. Then, throughout our conversation, I would perfectly time all my responses as to communicate how well it had been I had been doing without her. But not so much that I didn't leave the door open for us to rekindle our relationship. It was a delicate balance to try and strike. But as I heard muffled voices and rustling sounds of Clementina handing the satellite phone over to Carol, my elaborate plans were completely forgotten. All I wanted was to hear her voice and to know that she was okay. So I suppose it was strange that I gave her little chance to say anything at all. Hello? Hello? Hello, Carol? Carol? Are you okay? Are you safe? Are you calling from Afghanistan? I know. Brilliant. But it was 5 a.m. She laughed joyfully, the same way she had when we walked her across the campus all those years ago. Instantly, I knew something had changed. Over a scratchy and delayed satellite phone, in the heart of the most dangerous country in the world, Carol told me she had been praying for me in our relationship and realized that she had made a terrible mistake. She apologized for breaking up with me and for breaking my heart, and she asked if I would ever consider getting back together again. And there's a picture, and it says our wedding day, October 2003. Aww. Okay. A long, long chapter. You might imagine that I hesitated at such a question. After all, Carol had dumped me for someone else and had put me through my own private hell for 1 year. She had made me suffer more than I had ever suffered before, but before her question could even be fully bounced off the satellite into my ear, I had already replied. In truth, I had replied weeks and months ago. Yes, of course, sweetheart, of course, of course. The answer was easy because you will always be willing to suffer as long as it's for someone you truly love. How much longer is that? Okay, we got another couple pages. All right. Suffering is a surprisingly accurate expression of love, a fact my immigrant Korean parents demonstrated to me. My parents are not always easy people to get along with, or live with, or be related to. When I was young, what was most important to my parents was not my personal happiness or growth as a human being, but being first. First in school, first in tennis, first at cello. They very rarely told me that they loved me. In fact, they rarely do to this day. When I relate this to my American friends, they look at me in horror and gently pat me on the shoulder. What a horrible way to grow up, they murmur, tilting their heads at a particularly sympathetic angle. While I appreciate their sympathy and head tilting, I don't really need it. Although difficult at times, I am 100% certain that my parents love me because they suffered for me. In my childhood, my father owned a wholesale hat store in the West Loop of Chicago. I've heard that this neighborhood is rather nice now, known for its chic restaurants that showcase a variety of craft beers. But at the time, it was known mostly for crime. My father was robbed several times at his store. One time, someone clubbed him in the head with the butt of a shotgun, and then sprayed bleach directly into his eyes to expedite the getaway. To this day, when my father gets tired, his eyes take on a reddish-pink tint, a daily reminder of that experience. When my dad's hat business closed down, the 5-foot force of nature who is my mother decided to start her own furniture store. Never mind that she had absolutely no experience in that field. Between them, my parents worked over 100 hours a week in that store, assembling and delivering heavy furniture, never taking a vacation, never buying anything for themselves, although they shelled out thousands of dollars for lessons of various sorts. Whatever was most likely to guarantee their children entry into an Ivy League school. They didn't do this because they had a peculiar passion for selling hats or furniture, or staring down the barrels of shotguns. They endured these tortures solely for the sake of their children. My older sister, brother, and me. They were willing to suffer terribly because they loved us, because they wanted us to have a chance at a good life in America, go to a great college, and become either a doctor or a lawyer, but certainly not a pastor, and never have to endure the life they were forced to. And so, I don't need my parents to say they love me to know that it's true. Their years of sacrifice and suffering on my behalf have already made that abundantly clear. Not coincidentally, suffering is also how we can be certain of God's love for us. Jesus' life was similarly filled with suffering, from its beginning to its supposed end. He was born in a barn, or perhaps a cave, some scholars say, which is a pretty bad start for anyone, first century or not. But to make matters worse, the king of the Jews, Herod, wanted to kill him and was willing to massacre many other boys to do so. When Jesus grew older, he was despised by the religious authorities, who conspired to murder him. Eventually, they succeeded in getting him arrested and put on trial, where he was rejected by the very people he came to save, flogged and put to death by one of the most brutal means of execution at that time, maybe of all time, crucifixion. Christ suffered, that much is certain. But we should never forget that this suffering had tremendous purpose. Not only did Jesus' trials achieve the forgiveness of our sins, thereby restoring our relationship to God the Father, but they also served as a profound demonstration of the depths of his love for us. That is why the Apostle Paul wrote, "But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." Romans 5:8. The Apostle John put it this way: "This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us." That is what Jesus' pain was, not simply the mechanism through which he would pay for the sins of humanity, but also a declaration of his love for that same humanity. "I love you so much, I am willing to suffer and die, not for my sins, but for yours." Here lies the most damaging consequence of separating love from pain. We become blind to the depths of God's love. We Christians are people who stand in the shadow of the cross, covered in precious blood that was shed out of love for us, yet still weep bitterly because we fail to receive the cheap trinkets we so covet. We are children who live in a loving and safe home, but pout most wretchedly because our parents always give us what we need and only sometimes what we want. And this is the reason that in times of trial we are so quick to lose faith in God's love for us. We forget that his love is exhibited most clearly, not through our own pleasure, but through Jesus' pain. While hardly a flattering portrayal, it is for the most part an accurate one of us, especially of me. I cringe to think of all the times that I doubted God's love and power, even his existence, simply because my life was not going in the direction or at the pace that I wanted. But this also means that if we can somehow accept that suffering is one of the best proofs of love that exists, we might then be able to see God's love more clearly than we ever have before. And that's the end of chapter 1. I cannot begin to tell you how timely this is for me. And I hope that you find it timely for yourself as well. And until next time, be careful with that and enjoy, please and thank you. I will see you in the next chapter. Bye.